Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining our our third webinar for this year. And it's on adapting the serious illness conversation guide for your patient population. So thanks for taking the time to be with us today. I thought I can go over quickly some WebEx housekeeping. So we do want you to ask questions and comment. We have some really exciting presenters today, internationally represented, who will be sharing their work with us. So to do that, there's two main functions. One is to chat. Please chat to all panelists, and that way we can all read your question or comment. And we'd love to hear about your experiences, successes, challenges. If you want to say your question out loud, there's a hand button under the participants panel. If you just click that, let us know that we can unmute your mic and you can ask us directly. So we'll go over this again when we have our discussion time, but please keep the chat and raise hand function at top of mind and use them freely. And this webinar series is brought to you by our team at Ariadne Labs, who work on the community of practice. So we have Rachelle Bernacki, Dr. Rachelle Bernacki, and Francine Maloney, who were two key players in starting this work, and also Joanna Palladino as well, Dr. Joe, and myself as the host for these and putting the webinars together. So I think I'm going to pass it to Rachelle to talk about the serious illness care implementation. Rachelle, are you there? Oh.
Me?
Hi, Rachelle. Yes, I can hear you now.
Great. Super. So thanks, James, and thanks for joining us. So here at Ariadne Labs in the Serious Illness Care Program, we've really tried hard to build a flexible and an adaptable implementation model. And one of the key things about that is adapting the guide and the other elements of the program to your local system. And the importance of this is to ensure that you can sort of stand behind the guide and behind the program, and it also generates a lot of buy-in. So, so next slide. So today's objectives are really to think about the role of context in having serious illness conversations, talk a little bit about the lessons learned from the surgical checkup adaptation, and then we're really delighted to have Leigh Manson from New Zealand talk about their adaptation process, as well as Ingrid C, who's going to talk about the work that they've been doing up in BC in Canada. Okay, next slide. So here we have Leigh. You can see everyone that's going to be talking: Leigh, Sarah, and Ingrid. And we're just delighted. These three women have some remarkable achievements and really exemplify what we're trying to do in terms of adaptation. So next slide.
Great.
So we really want to think about what the context is in having serious illness conversations. And one of those things, next slide, is making sure that we understand that patients with serious illness are cared for in really different clinical contexts. So on the left here, you can see an ICU bed, someone that might be at home or maybe even a nursing home or in the outpatient clinic. And all of those settings may require some adaptation of the questions or the setup for having these conversations. And in order to have a successful implementation, not only all the elements of the program, like identification of patients and EMR, they need to be adapted to the setting that you're in, but the conversation guide itself needs to match those settings. So next slide. The other thing is that people have different serious illnesses. So you see one of the American Cancer Society ads with chemotherapy, and she's a mother. There's also patients with COPD or CHF, or I'm actually seeing patients right now who are having surgeries. And so those kinds of conversations might need to be framed slightly differently depending on who your patient is. And thinking about where you're going to implement and what the setting is, and then adapting to make sure it fits that setting is really important. Next slide. And patients are different. So today we have a kind of a really exciting group. So we have our group up in Canada and our group in New Zealand, so all over the world. And, it's really important to think about who your patients are and how you are going to make sure that the guide actually matches the local context. And, some patients, one thing that the guide, is inherent is that we in the U.S., although we're very multicultural, many times we think about the person as an individual decision maker. In other places, it might be a family unit that makes the decision maker, and we have to be able to adapt for that. There's also a lot of work going on in Japan and Asia, thinking about, their discussions about death may be more quiet or about serious illness. So there's to think about the context and the patient. Next slide. So this is my last and probably most important point is here are the two guides from New Zealand and BC Cancer Agency. And the most important thing about your guide is that it needs to be yours. You need to believe in it and stand behind it because you're going to be asking other clinicians to have conversations using this guide, and you have to believe that it works. So if you don't feel entirely certain about the version you're doing, then you need to change it. The other thing that I think is even more important than that is that you, when you are adapting, you're generating buy-in. So you're going to be inviting people into the process that are going to help you and make this be the New Zealand or the Kiwi guide or the BC Cancer, the BC guide. So people are going to really own it and feel like they're responsible for the quality of these conversations. And that process and the buy-in it generates is so incredibly important. Next slide. So, and the other thing is we really want to hear from you. We want to hear where the hotspots are of implementation. You see this slide of a blister, but, we want to hear, like, where is the guide, like, not working? So, because what are the adaptations that we need to do? Now, we've heard sometimes, like, in acute settings, you need to adapt it, and we've done that in our own hospital at the Brigham, where we've sort of adapted the way we use the program in that setting, and we call that the SAGE program. So we've changed it to meet the context and the needs. But those hotspots or those places where it's not quite working are your places where you can adapt. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to work. So if every time we ran into a hotspot and ran away from it, we'd be nowhere. Like we would have never gotten anywhere. So it's actually information. It's actually incredibly valuable information that shows you opportunities for improvement. Next page, or next slide. Okay, so now we have a poll. So we'll give you a minute to answer that.
The poll is closing up. If you haven't yet pressed submit, please submit now, and we'll share the responses out. Okay, so thank you to everybody for taking the time to do the poll. And it looks like 38% of you work in inpatient, and then 27% work in primary care and oncology, and then 23% are in nursing homes, and still others of you in specialty and intensive care. So all across the board. And 15% of you wrote other. We'd be curious to know what that is. Please chat to the panelists. We'd love to hear. And then 58% of you had said yes. We have had an experience where using the guide needed to be adopted for our patients. So we'd like to use that information knowing from you. For those of you who did say yes, 58% of you, what were those experiences where you felt it needed adaptation and what happened? So this is where we encourage you to chat to us or raise your hand, and we will be happy to start the discussion with you. And if you're not seeing the chat function, the panel should be on your right or in the floating panel on the bottom of your screen. You'll see a little speech bubble. If you click that, we'll see it come through. So some of you are already starting to chat to us. Thank you. So Terry said, we've used the guide in our community-based palliative care programs. That's great.
And Terry, did you make any adaptations in order to do that?
Yeah. Terry chatted back. No, it has worked well. So that's
fantastic.
Great. And Samia chatted, we are trying to start implementing it, but wanted to know how we can adapt it for the residents. And Kevin also chatted, at Optum, we are using the guide with nursing home residents. Albeit many nursing home residents don't think they have an illness. Many of the questions in the guide refer to your illness. So there's a comment from Kevin. And then Carolyn also chatted, using the guide and SNS adaptation for surrogate conversations. And we have one more chat in from Petra. We have a version for low health literates and are going to experiment in practice as part of an RCT with a health app that logs patient personal goals and symptoms. And it might need changes for the Netherlands. Well, welcome.
Those are fantastic comments. Really terrific. So it sounds like for the nursing home, there is some group in BC who adopted the guide for nursing home settings, and I agree this is a challenge for people who perhaps have frailty. They don't really necessarily see it as an illness or are older. So I think you know, sometimes people will change it to about your health, and that can work. And we've seen some other adaptations to probe more in the prognostic understanding. What is your understanding now about your hospitalizations, things like that, or how you're doing in terms of your function. I think there's different ways to potentially adapt. But I agree that when you're in a nursing home setting and they don't necessarily see something as an illness, it can be challenging.
We did have a few more people chat in also. So Lynn said they are working for a 168-bed hospital and outpatient with primary and specialists, and they have just started training providers and using guide with inpatient and primary care offices. And then Jacinta said, I've wondered about adapting it to people living with addiction and or homeless or marginally housed. And they could reasonably answer yes to the surprise question, but do not meet the traditional criteria for life-limiting illness and may not be inclined to sit through a prescriptive conversation. So,
it's a fantastic question. I think Ingrid has had some experience in that area. We have not used it in that setting, but I think it's really interesting to think about. So great. So it sounds like people are really thinking hard about this, and that's wonderful. Kang, is there any more? Should I move on?
I think we're okay to move on. Yep.
Well, thanks so much for letting us know what you're doing. It's really helpful.
And feel free to continue to chat us.
So we're just going to talk a few minutes about what we learned from the safe surgery checklist adaptation. Next slide. So at Ariadne Labs, the first work that was done with Atul Gawande and Bill Berry, it's really interesting. They knew that surgical safety was important, but they didn't really think of it as a public health issue, and there wasn't a ton of data on surgery and outcomes. And they knew what to do, but it wasn't done consistently. And so you can see here that there's a plane crash. And aviation is a great example of where they've used data in a very structured way to think about data and a structured process for how you evaluate failures. And in fact, I was just reading a Harvard Business School case about NASA, and there was similarly there, they went through a really structured process for when they had a failure, and I think that can be really helpful. Next slide. So what they did is they put together all the best practices in one place. They actually worked with a Boeing engineer that designed checklists for airplanes. And so, you know, being in the airplane and landing a plane is very stressful. Doing surgery is also very stressful. And they made sure that it all fit on one page. But they also knew that one size didn't fit all. So they allowed for some modification, like I talked about, which creates buy-in and real ownership. They feel like it's theirs. One thing that's really important about this process is you need to include an entire team, and that's everyone from who checks in the patient to the medical assistants to your interpreters. And I think one thing about both the examples that we have today is they're fantastic examples of using everyone on the team. There's certain things on the guide, though, that shouldn't be changed. And, you know, publishing why, we put a document on the community of practice that tells why the things are in certain order. Like, for instance, asking about what your understanding of illness to start with is a best practice, and that's kind of standard of care, so that you should start there. Other things about the wording or maybe some order of the other questions, those can be changed. But having some kind of document about what shouldn't be modified and what can be modified is really useful. So feel free to, you know, use that document and ping us if you have questions. But I think those are the things that we've learned from the using checklists in medicine, both in surgery and our guide itself. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to move into hearing from our two different examples of adaptation. And I think, Kang, you're going to tell us a little bit? Great.
We have our first presenter from New Zealand, Leigh Manson, here, and she's not joining in person because of the time difference, but I am happy to say that we recorded her portion in advance, and she'll be talking a little bit more about customizing the guide for New Zealand. And a little bit about Leigh is she is the program lead for the New Zealand Advanced Care Planning, and is the clinical communication training program run by the Health Quality and Safety Commission. So she has led health quality improvement programs for over 20 years in South Africa and New Zealand. And Leigh is a non-practicing attorney and improvement scientist who's determined to see continuous improvement in the timing, quality, and quantity of person-centric conversations in health. So we're excited to welcome her, and we're just going to queue up her audio and get ready to go.
So I'm going to start with a traditional mihi or a New Zealand intro. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Leigh Manson toku ingoa. Kei te noho ahau ki Aotearoa. So what I said there is welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Leigh Manson, and I am from New Zealand. So I am the Senior Program Manager leading the National Advanced Care Planning Program in New Zealand, and have had the honor and the privilege of bringing Serious Illness Conversation Guide to New Zealand as part of that program. So I wanted to include a map of the world to show you where New Zealand is, because often when you find maps of the world, they just sort of leave New Zealand off on the corner there. So for those of you who don't know where New Zealand is, I just wanted to point that out. So I thought I would start also to give you a little bit of context about New Zealand and the health system that we have, just to give you some context. So New Zealand has a population of 4.7 million people, and they live on a land mass smaller than Italy, but a little bigger than the United Kingdom. Our population is sort of 74% European, just over 22% Māori and Pacific people, and about 12% Asian, and that's growing exponentially with immigration from Asia. So our health system is essentially a fully public-funded health and social system, and our healthcare spend is about 8.7% of GDP, around $4,000 per capita. That's just a little bit of context about New Zealand's health system. So I wanted to share a little bit about where I come from. So that's to sort of zoom in on the three islands and make up New Zealand. And where the little green star is, the little place called Mapua, and I live there. And that's a picture of the wharf outside, well, not outside my door, but sort of down the road where we spend our summers fishing, swimming, and eating ice cream. Alrighty, so why is it important for us in New Zealand to have customized the Serious Illness Conversation Guide? Well, we found that it just didn't quite fit. So in the process of exploring the feasibility of bringing the Serious Illness Conversation Guide to New Zealand, we started by providing the Ariadne version of that to a number of clinicians across New Zealand and asked them to play with it a little bit and to give us some feedback about what they thought. And the feedback we got was that it didn't quite fit, that the language felt clumsy, that it didn't quite fit our culture, that there were things missing. And so we were really aware that if we wanted to be successful with implementation of the Serious Illness Conversation Guide in New Zealand, we would have to do something about that would have been a barrier that would have stopped any sort of rollout across New Zealand. So the other key thing about why we customized the Serious Illness Conversation Guide in New Zealand is that we needed to ensure that this tool didn't increase inequality for Māori. I'll give you a little bit of context to why that's important for New Zealand. Māori continue to have the greatest levels of health inequality in New Zealand, despite attempts to address this over the last decade. Measures of mortality and morbidity show significant gaps compared to non-Māori, even after controlling for deprivation. These ethnic differences in health status relate to a lot of things, largely environment, smoking prevalence, income inequalities, barriers to access, but most importantly for us with the Serious Illness Conversation Guide, a lack of shared background or understanding, provider bias, and communication skills, or the lack thereof. So I'm going to talk a little bit more later in the presentation about the HUI process, or the meeting process, that we're incorporating in the Conversation Guide and the training resources, which is aimed at improving the cultural safety and inclusiveness for Māori. Okay, so how did we go about customizing the guide? Before I go into the details of how we did that, I thought it would be good just to give you a little bit of an overview of the methodology that we used. So we used components of experience-based co-design. So co-design challenges the existing quality improvement paradigms commonly used in New Zealand health system. It encourages patients to take an equal role in the review and development of services. It focuses strongly on designing services around the patient experience of that service by using techniques and tools derived from service design. So within a health context, experience-based design is a method of designing better experiences for patients, carers, and staff. So the whole idea behind this is to remove the power imbalance between clinicians and consumers and to bring them together into a room, have clinicians share their experience, have patients share their experience, and then for them to find common understanding of their experiences, and then to work together to think about what they could do to overcome that, and then designing the potential solutions. So ideally, Experience-based co-design should start with a problem or an opportunity that we identify in health. So we shouldn't be coming with the solution, a known solution. It should be a problem. It's put to, it's put to the group, to clinicians and consumers working together. They spend some time understanding their experiences. They explore potential causes of the experiences that they're having. They think together, they work together to identify some potential solutions. And then, again, they co-produce the solutions. So that's ideal situation. Unfortunately, we had to do a little bit of a leapfrog because we already had the solutions. We had the Serious Illness Conversation Guide. So we had to sort of use the principles of co-design in that we brought together patients and clinicians and understood their experience of the guide, so of the tool, and then we got them to make some suggestions about how they think we could improve it. But unfortunately, it was sort of left to our project team to then take the solutions and adapt the guide. So that wasn't co-produced by clinicians and consumers, which would have been ideal. Okay, so how did we do this? So we organized 4 workshops across New Zealand, so 3 workshops across New Zealand in 3 of our larger cities. We brought together consumers, so patients, family, cultural advisors, and clinicians, really conscious of ensuring that we had Māori participation. And we had the groups come together and ensure that we didn't have more clinicians than consumers and family to ensure that we address that power imbalance. So the process of the workshops went a little like this. So what we did is we asked them to pair off and to use the Ariadne version of the guide and to read it, to experience reading the prompts, and the other person experienced hearing the prompts, and then we got them to swap around a little like the drill, but not with any of the responses to the prompts that we use in the training. After that, we asked them to take each of the prompts and categorize them. So they had an opportunity in mixed groups of cultural advisors, clinicians, and consumers to go with each prompt, say, well, are we going to categorize it green, which would have been the prompt worked well and we're happy with that? Or orange, nah, the prompt needs a little bit of work. Or red, we not responding well to this prompt and needs a rethink. We also gave them a white category for any additional prompts that they thought were missing from the guide, or some of the prompts that completely needed a rethink. So the group set about doing that, and that was largely the most of the 3 hours that we had the groups working together, was the sort of discussing and categorizing of prompts. And as you can see from the photograph on the slide of the actual prompt sorting, that most of the prompts landed up in that orange category, which is that the prompt needed some work. Quite a few landed in the red category, that they needed a complete rethink. Very few were lying in the green category of, yes, they're good to go. After they had finished the sorting, we then asked them to come up with alternative wording for the prompts that were sitting in the green and red categories. The orange and red categories. And what was particularly interesting is, as they were trying to do that, many of the prompts moved into the green category. So many of them, they felt actually, after thinking about how else you might say it, it sort of moved to the green. They moved it back to the green. All right, so what did we find? A number of themes emerged across the 3 workshops that we ran. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through each of the themes, and I'm going to tell you what we did to address the theme that emerged. So the first one is setting up the conversation was key, and that there was a lack of whakawhanautanga. So a whakawhanautanga is it's more than rapport. It's about connecting one person to another. So creating a real connection with the person you're having a conversation with before we start the conversation. So what we did to address this particular issue was we softened the language used in the introduction. So the next theme that emerged is creating the opportunity for whānau support. So whānau is a concept for family, but it's wider than your blood relatives. It's sort of your wider family, so your wider support network. So concern was raised about having people engage in a conversation of this nature without their whānau being there to support them. This is very important for cultures which prefer collective decision-making, which is the decision-making model that Māori and Pacific people prefer, that the patient autonomy is a foreign, not foreign, but a concept that is not something that sits that comfortably with Māori and Pacific people. They prefer to do a collective decision-making, but the decision-making is done not only for the benefit of the individual, but for the wider whānau. So how we address this is the training and training material was adapted, and we added a prompt to the guide in the introduction section to double-check whether the person wanted others with them. Okay, so the next theme that emerged is, please just make this simple. Just keep the language simple. So the language used was felt to be too wordy, too formal, and the groups wanted us to keep it simple and straightforward, to use plain English. So what we did is we adapted the words and tones of the prompts to accommodate that. All right, so the next sort of theme that emerged was the language and question structure experienced as paternalistic by the participants. So this got some of the consumers particularly hot under the collar. So the tone and language was described as paternalistic. It sounded like the doctor was telling me. And so what we did is we changed the wording of the prompts to be more inclusive and to emphasize the clinician and patient are in this together. So we use the word we instead of I. All right, so the next one was the balancing of power and avoiding testing the person. So during the workshops, caution was raised about the way the clinician asked the patient to tell them what they know. They said that they felt like they were being tested about do they know everything they need to about their health and their current health status. So what we did is we changed the wording to accommodate this and to reflect checking in and offering further information. Okay, so the next one is the use of the word worried. Okay, so this was overwhelmingly a negative response we got to the use of the word worried across the 3 workshops. Sort of felt that saying the doctor was worried raised a number of objections. So I'm going to quote some of the things we heard from people in the workshop. So what's the doctor got to be worried about? It's not him who's sick. Worried sounds scary. Sounds very serious. It's difficult to hear anything else after that. So what we did is, of the suggestions from people in the workshops, is we changed the word worried to concerned, and that seems to have really worked well. The next one is a lack of explicit pause following the prognostic statement. I see I've got a word mistake on the slide. So prognostic statement. So the lack of a pause or exploration of how the person was feeling following the prognosis shared felt rushed and unfeeling. So what we did is we added a note to allow pause and time for reflection, just to ensure that the clinician doesn't go from the prognostic statement straight into asking the next question, which is the first question in the explore section. All right, so the next theme was the explore prompts generated a lot of discussion. So it was interesting. All of the explore prompts, particularly the trade-off question and some of the other ones, they all landed in the red category, that they needed a complete rethink. But as I explained when I was talking about how the workshop was structured, many of those, after they were asked to rethink the wording, landed up being pushed either to orange or directly into green. So we largely left the explore prompts unchanged. There were just a few wording changes, but largely they remain the same. Right, and the last thing is closing was missing porapora aki. And I'll explain a little bit more about porapora aki in a minute, but it's about ensuring that at the end of the conversation, I understand, you understand me, and we found some common ground. And it was felt that was sort of missing in the conclusion. So what we did is we check in on how the patient is feeling, and we also give them an opportunity to provide more resources. So that the closing of our version is a little bit more open, if that makes any sense. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to run you through a couple of the actual examples for you to have a read and look at. So in the setup, you'll see the way that we changed the introduction to soften the language and make it more inclusive, and to address the sort of whakawhanautanga concept of in Māoridom. So our wording is, we want to make sure you have the best care possible. To do this, it would be good to talk about what is happening with your health and what things are important to you. Is that okay? And then you'll see underneath that we added this, which is the check-in to ensure that whānau are given an opportunity, or the person has been given another opportunity to say, actually, I don't want to have the conversation until my whānau are with me. So we cover that off in the setting up of the conversation. We ensure that that's really one of the key focuses for the clinician or the administrator to be thinking about when setting up the conversation, that the patient is given an opportunity to bring along their family. But again, we check in with them in the process of the conversation, just to double check that they understand it's a really important conversation, and give them another opportunity to bring along their family. All right, so in the assess section, this is the way we changed the testing question from what is your understanding now of where you are with your health or your illness. We changed it to make sure we are on the same page. Can you tell me your understanding of what's happening with your health at the moment? All right. So here's some examples of the way that we changed up the share section. So you'll see that I'm telling you what I know tone in the Ariadne wording, or what clinicians and patients in New Zealand found was sort of telling me, changed a little bit to, this is my understanding of where things are at. So a little bit sort of more informal language, followed by one of the 3 prognostic prompts, where we changed the word worried to concerned. And then we've specifically put in allow silence and explore emotion, just to remind the clinician that it's really important to give pause and to allow the prognostic statement to settle and to explore any responses before you start with your explore questions. And then the last one I wanted to just share with you is, this is the first explore prompt. So we changed it from what are your most important goals if your health situation worsens to what are your priorities if your health does get worse, which sort of follows on from whatever prognostic statement you may have just shared with the patient. Okay, so I said I was going to come back to talk about cultural safety in our reference guide as well as in our training. With the guide and the training and other resources, it was really important for us to ensure that there was a very clear message about being culturally aware. It's important for a clinician to understand their own implicit biases and to think about how that might impact the safety of the person or the person and their family. As I've already mentioned, Māori and Pacific people in New Zealand have worse health outcomes than others. So they have less access to services, they receive less treatments in hospital despite having longer stays, their life expectancy is substantially lower. And in New Zealand, we're under a treaty obligation to address this. One of the ways that we've wanted to do that with the Serious Illness Conversation Guide is to incorporate the principles of the meeting process from the hui process used by Māori in gatherings or in meetings. So I wanted to just touch on a couple of those before we wrapped up. So when setting up the conversation, really important, as I've already stated, to ensure that the person has the opportunity to bring along their whānau, that we emphasize the importance of hearing what matters most to the person and their whānau, and affirm that this information will inform the care and treatment offered. And then when we actually come together as a group to have the meeting, important to offer a karakia or a spiritual blessing as a way to open the meeting. If you do open the meeting in that way, you need to remember to ensure that you use a karakia or spiritual blessing to close the meeting, so that it has almost bookends of cultural safety for the space in which the meeting is going to take place. And then you enter into the process of mihi, or whakawhanautanga. So mihi are it's a form of introduction that you use in meetings, where you would look for connections of from various different areas. So you would look for connections or similar landmarks, so rivers and mountains that you hold dear or that you live close to, or you would find connections of family connections or tribe connections, or even for many people in New Zealand, the way they got here. So how did you arrive in New Zealand? Because we're all immigrants here in New Zealand. So the idea is to find a common connection, something where you and I have a common grounding or a common place. And that then creates the beginning of a safe environment within which to then have the conversation. So what we do is we do in the training and the material encourage clinicians to step outside of just building rapport and actually offer up something personal about themselves that the patient and their family can connect with before we then go into this very personal conversation. At the conclusion of the conversation, really important, and I mentioned this earlier, the process of poroporaki to ensure that you understand, that I understand what you said, you understand what I've said, and we found common ground. So I'm hoping that gives you a little bit of the cultural context in which we've developed the guide or adapted the guide, as well as developed our clinician's reference guide and other material that we use here in New Zealand. So we finished customizing the guide in August of last year. So we've been using it now for about a year in the process of starting to roll Serious Illness Conversation Guide out across New Zealand. And we're finding that it's generally accepted, that people feel comfortable with the language and the structure of the guide, which is great. Yeah, so that's it.
All right, so good morning and thank you for joining us. Sarah and I are delighted to be here with Ariadne Labs to talk about some of the work that we've done here in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. We're going to talk about the translation of the Serious Illness Conversation Guide into multiple languages, and we would love to just share some of our experiences as we have progressed towards getting these translations out. What started with something we thought would be relatively simple turned out to be a very complex process. So we wanted to help share that process in case some of you wanted to look at translating the guide into some different languages. Next slide, King. So Vancouver is very multicultural, like many cities around the world, and we translated the Serious Illness Conversation Guide into the following 11 languages. We use the Provincial Language Services, which is an agency that is used throughout British Columbia whenever healthcare is needing translations. And we work quite closely with them, and the first thing we did was do an assessment to see what are the top languages that PLS has been being book translators being used for healthcare. So we looked at the top languages, and we actually chose the top 10 languages and then added French, being that Canada is bilingual. We added French as part of the Serious Illness Conversation translation. Next slide.
So having these conversations are actually very challenging. To provide good palliative approach to care, we need to have really good goals of care conversations and advanced care planning discussions, and talking about specific details, including no CPR or different medical decisions. And these conversations, even in English, is really challenging and requires a lot of experience, expertise, and a lot of opportunities for learning how to better have these discussions. And when we're thinking about having conversations with patients and clients who speak a second language, it actually adds to a second layer. And we're always hopeful and trusting that our interpreters are hopefully translating properly the meaning and intention of what we're trying to convey to patients and families. And with that in mind, we really found that it might be really important to work with some of our interpreters just to make sure that they understand some of the meaning and intention behind the questions that we're sharing. Next slide.
So the two main concerns that we identified when we looked at translations, if you think of a lot of the medical information out there that gets translated into second languages, I've taken a look at things that were translated looking at post-surgery, wound care, any of the simple procedures, and then when we get into the no CPR, the pamphlets on that, I realized that the two main concerns that came out is that sometimes not all words can be directly translated. So if not all words can be directly translated, if we were just having the translators translate using the English version, some of those words can be lost, and as Sarah was mentioning, the meaning and intention can be lost. The second is that there are many synonyms in the English vocabulary. There are many synonyms in different languages. Sometimes if you picked a word that is similar, also the meaning can be lost. So those are some of our concerns when we are looking at direct translations of the guide into different languages.
Next slide. So when we're trying to integrate a palliative approach in all of the care that we're doing, we're using the Serious Illness Conversation Guide to try to integrate that. And however, we did find one of the biggest challenges was how do we translate this guide in a way that the meaning and intention is consistent in a second language. And so we then started to think about how can we work with some of these translators, interpreters, and healthcare professionals who do speak a second language. Next slide.
So as Sarah mentioned, there are some challenges. One of the challenges we actually notice is that the original meaning has been lost in the translation when we first did a translation. And an example would be the question, what abilities in your daily life in Arabic actually sounds more about activities such as basketball and gardening, and that was the feedback we actually got back from some Arabic translators, that you're not getting at the personal care, you're not getting at the finance, the day-to-day things that people find very important to maintain in their daily life. So we had to look at how we can look at translating that meaning so it reflects activities in daily life. And some words are difficult to translate into second languages. So something as simple as, to us, a substitute decision maker, is actually much more difficult to translate into a different language. Next slide.
So we're going to share with you some of the processes that we did and some lessons learned. And actually our first attempt to do the translation was basically look for a translation company who can help support us with translating the Serious Illness Conversation Guide into the 11 different languages. Then we received the translations back, and then we reached out to some healthcare professionals who speak a second language just to get their comments and feedback about the translations and see if it's something they would use as a healthcare professional's perspective. And then based on their feedback we provided, did some editing to the translations, and then we piloted with a small group of interpreters, because the reality is most of this work will be done by interpreters. They're going to be the ones using the guide, the translated guide. Next slide. So after we brought these translations to the interpreters, there was significant concerns from the interpreters regarding the translation. Their main concern was regarding about some of the wording. They felt like some of the words didn't translate properly. They all had different ways of expressing or communicating the original intention of the Serious Illness Conversation in their own language, and they felt that the translations, some of the wordings were not appropriate, and they all had different ways of saying it, and all but to capture the same meaning and intention. And then the other concern that they had was they had fear of offending patients and families. They were worried about what is the palliative approach. They're not sure how they can express properly some of these intentions that healthcare professionals are sharing. And so given their fear of actually sharing these conversations and as a second language, and also that they felt the wording wasn't appropriate, it actually led us to rethink about this process and wondered whether some of the translations that we received were the best translations. And the more we asked for feedback, the more clinicians and interpreters had different ways of saying the same thing in the English version of the Serious Illness Conversation. And next slide. So it became actually a snowball effect. There was more and more changes, and it became to a point where we decided we actually need to stop this process and have a look at this process again and think about what other processes are there to capture the best meaning and intention of the serious illness conversation in the translated version. Next slide.
So in our second attempt, as we stop to think about, geez, what went well and where did we fall short, we started to think about including the interpreter as part of the translation process. So if you look at the definition of translators, it's really turning into one's own or another language versus interpreters, one who translate orally for parties conversing in different languages. So there's a subtle difference in both, and we decided to look at one of the best practices in terms of translations. Next slide. So this is from Mnemonic Translations, and it talks about what is the best practice in terms of how to do a translation. So we actually start with doing a translation with the source document. That then gets translated. Then they go through proof and editing involving interpreters too, and then we do a back translation. So if we are translating a particular question in that second language, it is back translated to see if it actually matches the meaning and intention of the first question. That then gets edited again, and if we had to do a back translation again, we would follow that. And then we keep comparing until we actually come to agreements with the interpreters and translator that we are actually keeping to the meaning and intention of the question. So the biggest shift was really focuses on meaning intention rather than to make sure the words are matching so that we keep those questions as closely to what we want so that we can get the answers that the Serious Illness Conversation Guide was meant to achieve. Next slide.
So this is an example from the Serious Illness Conversation Guide, and an example where we did use back translation. And the question is, what are your most important goals if your health situations worsen? And using back translation, the back translation process, you'll see that the second line in there is the Chinese version of the translation. And when we back translate this, you'll see that it actually says if your health situation worsens at that time in your life, the most important will be what? And you'll recognize that the word goal was taken out in the back translation because they, as we heard from feedback, actually putting the word goals in there actually loses the meaning and intention of the question. And it means something completely different, or people will get confused if we use the direct translation of the word goal. And so this is just a very simple example of where we need to back translate, and there might be times when some of the words of the original question might not be in there, but the whole point is to keep to the meaning and intention of the original question. Next slide.
So we then finally, almost a year later, come up with a final draft product, which we actually reviewed with healthcare providers with the goal of keeping to the meaning and intention of each question. Healthcare providers actually were quite open to looking at that, knowing now that the way they're asking the question was meant to keep to the meaning and intention, and actually for the first time started to get some consensus around healthcare providers in that they can actually possibly use this guide. Next slide.
So currently right now we are in the clinician testing phase. We've done all the back translations and we are opening up to healthcare professionals who do speak a second language to have a look at the translated guides with the back translation. So seeing if this best translation actually is something that they can apply to their practice, if they have any comments or any other things that they would suggest to this translation. And all of these translations are available with Ariadne Labs, and I'm sure Kang and Rachelle and Francine will be able to direct everybody to find these translations in their community of practice. And what we're looking for is asking for some feedback from people, and if there's any other things that they would suggest that needs to be adapted or updated to the translations. We are very interested in hearing more feedback.
We are very conscious that It took several tries to get the English version to where it's at today. So we know that we probably have several more attempts to do the translations, but we are really relying on people to give us feedback, to have enough feedback to be able to help start looking through suggestions so that we can help improve the guide for everyone that's using the guides across the world. Next slide. So we didn't stop there because based on the feedback that we heard from interpreters, people really wanted education around the serious illness conversation because they are nervous. They are being asked to interpret conversations that are very sensitive in nature. And so because in Vancouver and the Lower Mainland, we really rely on interpreters for using the serious illness conversation, we decided to do some education for the interpreters themselves. So we started by running 2 sessions. We actually were able to get some funding to be able to pay the interpreters to come in to learn about the guide, but we were only able to catch about 50 out of 300, which is very, very low numbers because a lot of interpreters are working and were not able to come in. So we needed to look at a more sustainable education plan. So we wanted to share some of the work we've done. Next slide.
So in order to be more sustainable, we reached out to our learning technology team, and this is a picture of them. They worked really closely with us, and we worked with the instructional designer, programmer, and actually were able to create an online course for interpreters. Next slide.
So our target population for the online course were interpreters of all ages. We noticed some of the interpreters that we met in the earlier session, some of them were really young and really tech savvy, and our oldest interpreter was 81 years old, and he did not know anything about computers. So we had to figure out how do we balance that for the different age and different comfort levels, and also different learning styles. So we wanted to try to account for that as we developed the online course. Next slide. So one of the challenges deciding in the course was how do we make it meaningful for interpreters? How do we help them to support what is the intention behind the serious illness conversation? We wanted them to understand the palliative approach to care. We wanted to look at how do we make the course accessible because we are going by their feedback that they want to decrease their own anxieties while working as interpreters, especially when they're having more difficult conversations along with healthcare providers. Next slide.
And so this is where our online course for interpreters is housed, and it's actually available to the public also. You can follow the link on there, and you could try out the course yourself. And I'm going to just show you some screenshots of what's actually in the course so you can have an understanding if you might want to create something similar, or you might create something just for your interpreters in your own areas. Next slide. So we started off just by presenting some of the data that we found in Vancouver about the need for interpretation. And so this is just a visual graphic that our designer was able to create and really just to pop out some important components of using an interpreter. Next slide. And we started off also to talk about a little bit about palliative approach to care under the learning objectives. Then we introduced them to the serious illness care program from Ariadne Labs, and then afterwards introduced them through the serious illness conversation guide based on their translation. Next slide. And so again, why we talk to interpreters about why it's important to take this course, and we've included stuff about palliative approach to care in here also. Next slide. And this is just a very easy visual of the serious illness care program. We want interpreters to kind of understand why why the serious illness conversation guide is so important, and just having a bigger picture of how their role is in supporting good patient care. Next slide. And we also talk about their role as an interpreter and also answer a very important question that we hear is, am I being culturally insensitive when asking these questions? And we hear that quite often. And we do tell interpreters that reality is that healthcare professionals are just trying to find out people's values and wishes. And as an interpreter, their role is really just to help support understanding what those values and wishes. And so, no, they are not being culturally insensitive when they're supporting the use of the Serious Illness Conversation Guide. Next slide. And so when they get to the Serious Illness Conversation Guide, we ask them to choose the particular language that they're helping to support with interpretation. And we're going to be using the Spanish one up there on the top corner just to have a look at what actually looks like when they go into the translation. Next slide. And so when they go in, they actually, because interpreters are interpreting a conversation, we actually have a voiceover that actually reads out the Serious Illness Conversation question for them. And then after they hear it and they read the question, we ask the interpreter, actually, there's a free text box where they can type in, or we ask them to write it out, how they think they would best translate what they heard. And then after they write it out, the green left side box shows up and it gives them the best translation, and we're encouraging them to compare their own translation with the best translation that we've written, and then look at the meaning and intention of these questions. And with this work, we're hoping that the interpreter can analyze and evaluate their own way of interpreting and comparing it with the best translation available. Next slide. And we do this for all the questions in the Serious Illness Conversation. So then we move on to question 2, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. We also do spend a little bit of time talking about the prognosis sharing, because even for healthcare professionals who do speak English, they do find the prognosis sharing is quite challenging and needing a little bit more explanation. So with interpreters who speak a second language and interpreting, we want to make sure that they're aware of the intention behind the sharing and what kind of healthcare professionals might be using which particular prognosis framework. So we give them a bit of background here. Next slide. And then afterwards, then they go through all of the remainder questions, including all the key topics and the recommendations, and again, sharing with them the best translation and the meaning and intention of it. And then we end off with some key points that we want them to think about, just some practical tips for the interpreter as they move along with supporting this work. Next slide. And that would be the end of the course. And the course actually takes around half an hour to 45 minutes to finish. Next slide.
So practical tips. It's really, for us in this whole learning process, it was really helpful to have interpreters along with translators working together as we do the translation, back translation process to really keep to the meaning and intention of each question. One thing we really learned was not to get hung up by the wording, because everyone has their own choices. And if you're using the Serious Illness Conversation in English, sometimes you change the way the words are used. It's just really important to focus on the meaning and intention of the statements or the question. And as we mentioned, we are in the clinician testing of the translation. That's really important because we want to make sure that the guide is going to be useful and reflective of what we're trying to achieve. And what we did teach clinicians, and I think this was one of a very important tip that we've learned, is if you are going to be using the translations, print the translation out. So if you're using Spanish, print the Spanish copy out. For yourself as a clinician, print the English copy out, because what we are teaching our staff to do is when you're using an interpreter, to read the guide verbatim in English, verbatim. When you read it verbatim, because it's been tested and translated and back translated, then the Spanish interpreter or the other interpreters can actually read their questions as they are written. The minute you change how you ask the question in English, the interpreter then has to mirror what you say and will change how they ask the questions from the guide to mirror you. And then what would happen is that sometimes the translation and the meaning and intention of the questions is completely changed or has been lost. So we really encourage you to, if you're using translator, read the English version verbatim and have this translated version for the interpreter so they can read it verbatim to keep to the meaning and intention. So I believe we've come to the end of our section, so we wanted to thank you for your time and for being here today.
Note that so Leigh's adaptations, also the resources that Ingrid and Sarah are seeking feedback on for clinician testing, all their translated materials are on the COP, as well as what Rachelle mentioned on, what's the rationale behind the order of the guide, for example. What are the things that can be modified? What are the things that are very intentionally placed the way they are? This document exists as a resource on the COP, as well as when you're adapting, we do have a Creative Commons license, how to utilize that and appropriately. And there's a version of the guide that you can adapt, as well as a Word document on the community of practice. We'd love to know, these are just things we've created based on what we've heard from you on the COP. We'd love to know what else is there that's missing that you need to adapt this work to your patient populations. So we did get a number of questions and comments throughout, so we're just going to post that on the community of practice in the interest of time. And we want to just thank you for joining us today. And a quick plug for our next webinar before we conclude, that we'll be meeting in January, and we'll be answering questions such as, like, why is it important to be able to identify patients who might benefit from a serious illness conversation? And what are some of the best practices out there to ensure that a patient who needs a conversation has one? So we're excited to present Dr. Josh Lakin and Dr. Anuj Dalal, who will be sharing about his own work and method in finding those patients who might be seeking or need a conversation or benefit from. So that's on Tuesday, January 7th. We hope to see you there, and we thank Rachelle and Ingrid and Sarah and Leigh for their work and sharing their work with all of us, and to all of you for joining. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this will be posted on the community of practice, and we'll hope to see you there and in our next webinar. Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.